people in.
Thank you.
Hello,
Hi.
how you doing today?
Wonderful. Thank you.
Good.
Good afternoon. It is fabulous to see everyone. It is just noon, so we're going to start. We are here for the month of February with Rabbi Laurence Kotok. What does being a Reformed Jew mean yesterday, today, and tomorrow? And there are many wonderful things about Temple Bethel, but one of the most wonderful is that many rabbis, after they spend their careers in one place, come and make Florida their home, and many come to Temple Bethel as their house of worship and have different roles in that house of worship. Some, come here to pray, some teach every once in a while, and some become truly integrated into the life of the synagogue. And that is Rabbi Kotok. He personally, for me, is a mentor and a guide and someone to check in with in a way I've never really had before in my career. So I love having him here. If you were here Friday night, he also has a role as a professor at Catholic Seminary that is up in Boynton Beach. And he is a true friend of the synagogue. He does a private Torah study group with a small group who engaged him to do that. And in addition to the temple he was at for many years, this is also his temple, and we're so lucky for that to be. He has been Temple Brit Kodesh rabbinic scholar and senior advisor for lifelong Jewish learning for many, many years in his career. In 2014, he retired as senior rabbi and became a front row sitter in the Reform movement and watched its change and growth over the decades. He has served the community for 18 years and Brit Kodesh. And before arriving to Rochester in the summer of '96, he served the North County Reform Temple near Tamid of Glen, Cove for 22 years. He expresses a love for the people and land of Israel and is involved with ARZA, the Reform Rabbinic Cabinet for Israel, national chair of that. Also on the board of the Jewish Child Care Association, both in New York and UJA Federation. His longstanding involvement with interfaith understanding has been recognized by numerous local and national rabbis, and he is currently, as we said, on the faculty at Florida-wide Catholic Seminary. So, Rabbi Kotok, I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. So good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this journey we're going to be taking over the next few weeks about trying to identify and clarify what the Reform movement has really presented as its belief structure over the course of its evolution and time frame, with the hope that as we conclude to this, we will be able to figure out where this movement that has had such an imprint on the Jewish world is going, what its hopes might be for the future, and what your own personal belief structure is impacted by what you think the movement is presenting you. So with that very ambitious goal, we're going to begin with yesterday. And part of what we want to bring to the table, and I'm going to be sharing the screen and showing you some documents as we do this, and then interpreting the documents as we kind of look through it. But I have to get back to my back screen. Where am I? How do I get to my desktop, Jessica?
Press escape on your keyboard, upper left.
Okay.
And then if, are you going to share? And then press on the document you want to share, and then do share screen.
Okay. I just got to move these things out of the way, but they're not going out of the way.
Do you have a PowerPoint?
No, they're just docs.
Okay. So go click on the first doc you want to show, then go back to your Zoom.
I think I got it. Hopefully it's coming forward. Okay, I pushed the wrong one. That's not uncommon. Some of you have seen some of this stuff in the past. So here we go, taking a look at the kind of origins of the Reform movement initially in Europe. And the way that it began was really a byproduct of the French Revolution, which brought about the introduction of Jews being given the opportunity to be part of the general society, which they had not really been in before. They lived in a parallel universe during most of the Middle Ages because they were outsiders. They were not part of the system. Jews were the other, viewed, and in some cases, even today, viewed as individuals who are really citizens of a land of Israel and kind of resident aliens living in other places. Well, that was very much the factor in Europe when Napoleon went about to establish universal citizenship for the first time since the Greeks and uncovered not just the serfs of France, the Christian serfs, but the Jewish community. And the questions that were asked of them were specifically, can you be actual citizens of another country in the event that we perceive you as being in exile from the land of Israel? And part of what the genius of the original reforming individual rabbis was to find a way to allow Jews to become full and complete as best as possible, because we know that emancipation didn't really function in its dream in the 19th century, with allowing them to be as much part of the culture and society while hopefully retaining their own identity. And that's what the goal of the original Reform movement is, which then raises the question for you to ponder. What were these choices motivated by? Were they motivated by a commitment to an idea of beliefs, or was it to an accommodation to finding a way to live within the society and the culture, which is a question that still exists in modern Jewish challenge of identity? So the original reforms were very simple by Israel Jacobson, which was mixed seating, the reuse of the vernacular, and the reintroduction of music. That was it. But that group, that individual, was followed by other individual reforming rabbis and communities that ultimately evolved into a movement. Now, if you just follow through with this chart, you can see that as in the heading 3, reform becomes a movement.
So, Larry, I think you need to share the chart. You have to
sharing it. Can you not see it?
Do share screen and then click on the document.
I'm sorry.
I've done that many times.
I really have made a mistake here.
Where I think I'm sharing. Just share screen and then it should be a choice.
I thought you could see it. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We got this. Okay, now I got it. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for helping me through it. So if you see where it says reform becomes a movement, you can see that there were various conferences that were held, and we're going to look at those as we go on. But again, I want you to look at them through the eyes of what were they trying to accomplish? Were they really looking to enhance belief and practice, or were they merely trying to find a way to accommodate Jews in a new role in the new culture? And one thing that we have to remember, and many of you who have studied with me before are familiar with, every modern iteration of Judaism today is a byproduct and a reaction to modernity. These are movements which were created out of the new changing circumstance of attempts, not necessarily successful, of integrating Jews into the Christian culture of Western civilization in Europe, as well as here in the United States, to gain a sense of parity, which is what many of us have not only experienced, but benefited from, which is now, of course, being challenged by the rise and the explosion of anti-Semitism, which was always under the current. Nonetheless, think about these conferences, which we're going to look at as we move forward. This is to just provide some backdrop into the evolution of our particular movement. And you can see that the reforming movement in Europe transferred itself into the culture and experience of the United States. And one of the key players in that was a gentleman named Isaac Mayer Wise, who was originally European, but came to the United States and wanted to create an indigenous American Jewish response. So as part of that, and you can look at the organizations which he created under item 4, first off, he created the old Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which is now referred to as the Union for Reform Judaism, URJ, and the Hebrew Union College. Well, what was his goal? He didn't want to just import European rabbis to the United States and have them work here. He wanted to create indigenous American perspective rabbis, just like what we've done in the state of Israel, where the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem is looking to create Israelis to serve that movement, because culturally and in terms of identity, they are more aware of it than someone coming from another place and time. So these institutions initially were the outgrowth of the genius of Isaac Mayer Wise. But you can already see some of the flaws in the perception with the creation of Ethical Culture Society, because that was already the next iteration, not by purpose, but out of culture and society, to create what they believed was a ethical model based dominantly on Jewish ethics without all of the God stuff and religion. And then it moves on to the way in which here in the United States, they started looking at what do we believe, who we are, and we're going to take a look again at the Pittsburgh platform today, because it serves as the original foundational description of what they believed reform should mean in the yesterday history. And then you move on through the various experiences of the movement to 1926, when the World Union was created, which is still in existence. JIR, the Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, was not always a part of the Hebrew Union College. In fact, when it was founded, it was to provide rabbis who would determine what movement they would be part of. So there are rabbis who became part of the Orthodox movement who are graduates of JIR, not any longer, because HUC and JIR merged together. Okay, so you've seen that. Now let me see if I can get to the next document. And
Well, while you're doing that, I'll just say, it just so happens that Temple Bethel is hosting for 2 weeks an Israeli Reform rabbi who will be with us as part of a program Hebrew Union College is doing, that they're bringing Reform rabbis to the States to watch what we do. So it's kind of that question you raise is amazing. Like, is it about creating something new, or is it changing geography? And I think that it's been both for Israeli Reform and American Reform. I remember when I was a tour guide for the Reform movement in Israel, in the 90s, they couldn't use Israeli guides. They needed American Reform guides because there was just not an understanding of Reform Judaism in Israel, that, these American Reform kids were being insulted if they had a parent that wasn't Jewish or all that. So, the pride of the Reform movement in the United States versus the rest of the world is more complicated. So,
okay. Now, what you don't see this yet, right?
No.
Okay. How do I got to go back to
share.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I got it now. Okay. So what you're seeing here is the attempt to explain initially how practices in the early Reform movement saw its changes from what it referred to as orthodoxy. And as many of you remember, orthodoxy is not the same, and we talked about this yesterday in another class, is not the same as the way in which both the Reform and the conservative movement have been framed. Our movements were created with a centrality of franchise. So there was a congregational body, there was a rabbinic body, there was a seminary that produced individuals. In the Orthodox community, it is far more diverse. There are lots and lots of different orthodoxies. Many of them practice very similarly, so that's what we're looking at here. In the early times of Reform changes, they tried to move away from the all Hebrew service and repetitions which existed. The Messianic belief became changed in the early Reform idea, and many of you are familiar with this concept of the creation of the Messianic age. That was a belief shift. I got to figure out a way to move this up. I'm going the wrong way. Okay. Role of women. We know that certainly within the Orthodox community, women are still in a secondary position to the role of men. Our movement had created a parity of roles for men and women. In some cases, it was not as obvious in the past as it has certainly become in our current iteration in terms of the role of rabbis, cantors, educators, and such. But there was a parity expectation. Sabbath and observance. The idea of driving to synagogue as opposed to walking, marriage and divorce. We initially were only involved with civil divorce as opposed to Jewish divorce, the get. Mourning customs, some of which were changed for perhaps just convenience. Okay. Now, what I'd like you to be thinking about is, what do you, in your own minds, think were the driving reasons why they even considered these challenges as, in some way, impediments to Jewish integration? And the question I ask is, were they more interested in integration than they were in beliefs? Leave it open for the moment, because what we're going to look at now is the primary document of the original American Reform community's attempt to define its own series of beliefs and ideas. Let's see if I'm getting there. Okay, that's going to be a PowerPoint. I can share that too, right? Right? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, just want to be sure.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I'm thrilled you're here to help along. Okay. Come on. Oh, here we go. Now I have to go back to share. I'll figure this out.
It's okay.
Okay. Okay, I got to get down here.
It's confusing because you get on the document, you think you're seeing it, so everyone else is seeing it.
Yep. Okay, I can't move you. Okay, I've got to do this. That's going to help me. I got this thing that says the meeting is being recorded, which is...
Just say yes. Just agree to that.
Okay. Look at that. That got rid of it. Excellent. Okay, here we go. All right.
Fabulous.
All right. So now, many of you have seen this many, many times before, but I'm wanting you to view it out of this perspective of what were they trying to do? What were their goals? And what were they saying about the beliefs that would become the normative platform for a Reform Jew who was looking to kind of figure out who and what they are? So here is this document in 1885, which starts off this conversation. So read it once again, this first description. And if you would be so kind, after you complete that, talk to me a bit, if you can, in the system, about what you think they're trying to teach or imprint on the minds of those who identified within the American society of being a Reform Jew in 1885. Oh, I went up too far. Sorry. Okay, any thoughts?
People can unmute. I mean, I'll just say what I love about it as someone who always thinks about we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we don't always listen, but we need to listen twice as much. Wanted to really show like a really, we hear where you are in the 1880s in regards to religion, like a very high sensitivity to like meeting people where they are at that moment in time while not throwing out the traditions. Like, you know, I wish sometimes we would talk to each other this way. Like, we recognize what's graspable for you and what may not be graspable for you. It's very like empathetic, which I would not expect from a bunch of 1885, you know, platform writers. But it with the light, you know, with the phrasing of your question, there's a lot of empathy here.
Any other thinkings? Okay, take a look at number 2. As you read that, what juts out to my mind is this line about the Bible reflecting the primitive ideas of its own age. They were trying to be, in their view, modern. And they were attempting to make what they saw as the old perceptions of Judaism modern. Now, being modern is a lovely thing. The question is, are you rejecting ideas which are historic and important by claiming it's primitive? And the idea of miraculous narratives is something that I believe modern Jews struggle with also. You know that bad joke about the parents pick up the kid from Hebrew school and they say, tell us what you learned today. Oh, it was amazing. The Jews, they had rockets and they had jets and tanks and they had drones and they got the Egyptians at the sea and they were able to accomplish their goals. And the parents say, what are you talking about? He said, that's more believable than the story that they tried to tell us. Okay. It's the same kind of an idea. What were they trying to accomplish? Now, look at number 4, because that's where we start to see a real compounding of challenge. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinic law as regulate diet, purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas that are foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They fail to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness, their observance in our days. Okay.
You have a hand up, Rabbi. Do you want me to wait or?
Oh, no, let's Margaret in. I didn't know. I didn't see it. I'm sorry.
Margaret, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is now being addressed in this number 4, because what I was looking at immediately in that too was that these people were embarrassed by these Jews in their black coats and all of that type of thing. And I think that was part of it. They wanted to be part of the society, and that like everybody else, they just want to see all those funny looking people,
right?
Be identified with them.
So, Margaret, I think what you're really identifying is some of their motivation was to represent themselves in a very different way, so they would appear to be less foreign.
Yes.
To that point,
they wanted to be like everyone else. They didn't want to be pointed out as different.
Exactly. So some of you have read either The Grandees or Our Crowd, the Stephen Birmingham, really important representations of the early Jewish communities in the United States, where Jews had risen to some level of position and promise in America. Not everybody, but certainly the German Jews had moved ahead economically. And there was a challenge as Russian Jews started to come in and migrate around this same time period. And one of the most disturbing or fascinating aspects of that was the way in which a plan known as the Galveston Plan was put into place through the influence of some of the powerful Jewish families in New York that were able to get the ships that were coming not to land in New York, but to land in Galveston, Texas, because they didn't want to be associated with, in their mind, the riffraff, radical, black-coated Jews that were coming in from Eastern Europe. Now, clearly, they weren't able to divert them all, because New York was a haven for many of our families and relatives who did come from Eastern Europe. But what they are saying here is very critical when you think about it. Just think about what the role of kashrut meant in terms of people's integration into culture and society. Independent of why anybody does it or what its value is or its purpose, and I'm not trying to say it makes you more healthy, that's not the point. But if you couldn't eat with your neighbors, you stayed away from your neighbors. If you were a strictly kosher regulating human being, it's before we had all of these universal kosher restaurants like we have in Boca today or in New York or other places. You didn't interact with other people. Now, when we move on to the issue of dress, how did Reform congregations implement this idea? And we talked about this in another class yesterday. If you walked in with a kippah or a yarmulke, as they used to say, what did they do? We don't know here. Take that off.
Right.
Whereas if you were going into a conservative or an Orthodox place and you didn't have one, You better put that on because you're not going to get in here. The idea that there are Talasim at Bethel is something that historically was anathema. We don't do that. That's not who we are. And unfortunately, some of those symbols got portrayed bigger than life in the identity model of who and what we were, as opposed to the rest of the community. So we need to think about what was their motivation.
Right.
Again,
Yeah, but Judy, go ahead. Judy, go ahead.
That's exactly what I was going to ask about. What did they want? I mean, it sounds like they're removing Judaism from the tradition about what we are.
Thank you for that. Because I think what I'm hoping to accomplish in this series this month, certainly with Rabbi Matz's support and help, is a lot of what we have inherited in the modern Reform community is a byproduct and an extension of some of this behavior, confusion, boundary setting from 1885. And I can understand them wanting to appear acceptable because they really saw themselves as the other. There was a point in American cinema that was very much enamored of what was going on the Lower East Side during the migration of Jews. There was that movie Hester Street and a couple of others. But if you recall what the films tried to present, independent of reform, was I speak English very well, I can pass. Or I'm not wearing the garb that makes me look like I'm still from Poland. I'm looking American. I'm not a greener, as they used to say. But those movies were really identifying this challenge of how does one become an American?
So there's a lot of mocking of it. So it so happens Seth Rogen and Jonah Hill both have two movies that come to mind. And even Keanu Laurie's daughter, Shiva Baby, her movie, that take that and like turn it on its head. Like Seth Rogen, the pickled movie, like he gets pickled. I don't know if you saw, and Jonah Hill has a new movie about Black Jewish relations, and Laurie's daughter's movie, Shiva Baby, all take like, yes, you told me, that it's like you went from American to the 60s where I think you re-embraced your identity. And now these movies are saying, Judaism doesn't really fit with my lifestyle. It's almost like and you look at the Israeli government today and the chasm that exists, there, it's like, are you saying that like but because of the foundation that's built here, like we got to this place?
I think that certainly America and our perceptions of self would make it appear, and I don't mean to go way beyond where we're starting from. The Pittsburgh platform, I believe, has become contemporary Reform Jewish reality. I don't know if it planned it that way, but I think that it now becomes the paradigm for how individual Jews see themselves almost in a prophetic way, how this reflected the role of assimilation, acculturation, integration, that it now reflects itself. So keep looking at this material. Look at the next point, number 5. Look at what is being changed there. The modern era of universal culture of heart and mind. Now, just stay with that part of the statement. Judaism historically, for those of you who have engaged and tried to understand in your own lives as adults what this whole thing is about, have uncovered the idea that in Jewish historical perception, there's always been a healthy tension between universal goals and individual needs, and that they played off each other. And what we learned from reviewing past history, as much as it's relevant to today, is that when we went too far in one direction or another, we lost our footing. That we really needed to have these two tensions working in order to be able to live our destiny. At the beginning of our conversation today, I said, and I'll say again, the initial goal of the reforming Jewish movement and the conservative Jewish movement, which comes around 1860s, were both goal-oriented to allow Jews to find a place to maintain their identity and their beliefs while living in the general society, not being separated out. Now, if I might continue that thinking for just a moment to help you kind of grasp all of this, we know enough about the Middle Ages to think about the concept of the ghetto, which was picked by many European leadership as a place to keep Jews separated from general culture and society. Well, as stagnant as that might have been, it was also secondarily protective of Jewish behaviors and beliefs. It's kind of like people who can remember that they grew up in a Jewish neighborhood. And in those Jewish neighborhoods of America, there were things you just didn't do because they were Jewish neighborhoods. You didn't take your garbage out on Saturday because other neighbors would be concerned about you doing that. Well, now that we can live on any street, on any block for the most part, that kind of internal boundary models don't exist anymore. The ghetto did that in the most extreme. Well, so when the ghetto walls come down with the role of Napoleon, I perceive that that's what the reaction that became modern orthodoxy, which was basically, if we don't have the ghetto walls anymore to identify and control our beliefs and practices, we'll do it on our own. And that's where we have to consider whether that kind of boundary issue exists within a Reform community. And that's an open-ended question that we will consider as we proceed in the month. Because from my perspective, it's something that really is necessary. Doesn't have to be restrictive, doesn't have to be punitive, doesn't have to be negative, but we need to understand where are the boundaries, as wide as we may make them, because at some point we fall off the path. So in this question of universal culture, what is it that they are really looking at? They are addressing Messianic hope as a universal kingdom of truth, justice, and peace for everyone. Universalism. Wouldn't it be great if the whole world was nice? This is no longer about Jewish identity or Jewish expectations of self or the world. And what does that ultimately boil down to? We expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship unto the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. So in a very dominant way, what is the primary outcome of this? There are several, but what is the primary outcome that this platform rejected?
Judy, go ahead.
Judaism. They're taking away everything.
Well, more than just Judaism, I want you to think about what else is going on in the world at the same time that we are talking about this in 1885. And let me fill in the blanks. I mentioned early on that emancipation in its concept was a remarkable shift in the way in which Jews were to be viewed and how Jews were going to hopefully live. We know it didn't work out exactly the way they thought it would, because there still was enormous inherent anti-Semitism, and there still was a rejection of fully integrating of Jews. We know that in 1848, there were revolutions in Europe, which was a motivational force for many German Jews to leave Europe and come to the United States. We know that as the 19th century progresses, one of the answers to the failure of emancipation is the creation of modern Zionism. The idea being we can never be full and complete citizens of a country because we will always be viewed as secondary, if not inferior. And that until we can be a nation and identify ourselves, we will not have parity.
There are two raised hands, just so you know.
Okay, I just want to finish the sentence.
Uh-huh.
Part of what the motivation for modern Zionism was exactly the failure of emancipation's integration of Jews as full and complete citizens. Okay, questions?
Margaret, and then Judy, and then
Well,
Susan.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, what they were rejecting is a Jewish homeland. They were very clear, and that was coming out at that time.
Yes, they were anti-Zionist, and that's what occurred there. Judy?
No, I'm trying to lower my hand. It didn't. That's from.
Okay. Susan?
Well, I was going to say something similar to Margaret. It says no longer a nation, but a religious community. So when there are a group of people together, even today, and they're talking about their nationalities, it's he's Polish, he's Italian, he's British, and she's a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
And so the religion versus nationality, I'm an American. So this has always been a sore spot with my husband. That was always, he was the Jew and everybody else was what, Irish or whatever.
Yes, I think that in American evolution, this was existent independent of our own way that we projected ourselves. What the Pittsburgh platform does in very black and white ways is saying that this reforming Judaism is no longer interested in the restoration of a Jewish state. This is going on while there is active participation and creative thinking about the recreation of the existence of the state of Israel. Theodore Herzl, Achad Ha'am, a whole host of thinkers are trying to find a way, both intellectually and physically in terms of their efforts, to create and re-exist a land of Israel. 1885 is just 12 years before the first World Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, which was attempting to establish a true and independent state of Israel. They were not interested. They saw this as some kind of an impediment. Now, let me bring you back into more modern times because of this dual identity thing. Some of you remember Alan Dershowitz's books that are now 30 years old, Chutzpah and The Vanishing American, whatever it was called, where he attempted to say that he believed this concept that many Jews through time created, that they were merely guests here in the United States, as opposed to full and complete citizens, had in his mind evaporated, and that we were now integrated into fully American culture and society, and we no longer had to think of ourselves as Jews, but we were Americans whose religion was Jewish. Now, part of what is undercurrent here in number 5 is that Christianity in America had only really been a series of religious beliefs. We know that Judaism was far more than just a series of religious beliefs. We know this as we move forward into the 20th century with a book by Mordecai Kaplan called Judaism as a Civilization, where he captures in his perception the fact that Judaism is much more than just a religion. It's a peoplehood, it's a history, it's culture. And what I'm trying to say is this Pittsburgh platform tried to separate out all of those other components from Jewish experience and Jewish history into making us appear to be just like our neighbors. We had a religion. We had religious beliefs. All of those other strands were cut off as an attempt to make it appear more like what our neighbors looked like. So this rejection of the state of Israel still exists in certain quadrants of Reform perception. And unfortunately, even though we had become a fully Zionist movement, in the modern years, in the past years, we see more and more members of our community either hypercritical or rejecting of the existence of the state of Israel, which is incredibly disturbing as we kind of evolve our belief models. Let's keep looking. Okay, number 6.
I mean, this is beautiful. And, you know, Boca is a community where all the branches of Judaism and their leaders are really close and adore each other. But there are moments like a few years ago when a mosque was a polling place and then that was pulled back. And, you know, anytime there's, you know, something unkind against other religions, like it is the Reform synagogue and the conservative, I would say, that step up in fellowship. You saw that in Pittsburgh when
Yes.
Jamie Gibson's a longtime Pittsburgh rabbi and the imam had a deep friendship, and that showed up in that shooting. And this is, I mean, there's some things that are really beautiful about looking back at this right now, because that wasn't a world that was all about, oh, we love our fellow religionists at all. And in some ways it takes the persecuted to say this. Like there's no American Christian running around in 1885 saying, you know, like, oh, we got to watch out, make sure the Jews and Muslims feel comfortable in this country. Maybe some, but it wasn't like I mean, you look at, if you've listened to Rachel Maddow's Ultra podcast, even up until World War II, there's such anti-Semitism in the American system, let alone 1885.
What this is representing, and I'm supportive of this, is the fact that we within our movement have been the leaders and the motivators for interfaith relationships and dialogue. Whereas the Orthodox community has remained almost universally in their own world, not interested in the outreach. The conservative movement has come a long way and is now also engaged. But I must say, there are sadnesses and disappointments with the failure of these relationships about those communities not coming to our defense especially in regard to a lot of what is boiling into our culture with these enormous acts of anti-Semitism. There are isolated examples, but it's not what we hope the relationships would present and afford to us. So the idea of us in this statement is also reinforcing an idea that Judaism never taught that it was the only true and complete faith system, and that other faith systems were inferior, if not false. So think about that for a second, because we have existed in parallel relationship to Christianity and Islam. We never said they were false faiths. We merely have said they were faiths that brought people to the one God, the universal one God, but they were not pathways for Jews. We had our own path, which was Judaism. Now, let's be clear. The latest Pew results show us that close to 50% of Americans are in Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. They're what's referred to as nuns, N-O-N-E-S's. They are not connected to any religious community whatsoever. And that's part of what we're struggling with in terms of the way in which we both identify ourselves and the way in which our beliefs come into the general society and culture. Number 7, we reassert the doctrine of Judaism that the soul is immortal, grounded in the divine nature of human spirit, but we reject the ideas not rooted in Judaism, the belief of physical bodily resurrection, heaven and hell. These are significant. And I mentioned this in class yesterday. Our prayer books have only recently reinserted some of the texts in the standing prayer, the Amidah, that used to specifically refer to Mechayeh HaMetim, who caused the dead to live, which was a reference to physical bodily resurrection, which came into Judaism from the Greeks and then became a core and central concept of the claims of Christianity. We changed that in our movement to the words Mechayeh HaKol, which causes all things to be in life, and a kind of equivocal representation that used to be referring specifically to physical bodily resurrection. They saw those as impediments to modernity, the idea of heaven and hell, and so on. So, and again, I'm not asking you to do this at this class, but I'm asking you to think about, what do you think Reform Judaism says about what happens when people die? Think about whether you have any clarity about what our movement says to you, independent of your own beliefs that you've evolved over the course of time, and whether, in fact, we should be saying something about it. There was a brilliant book written by a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Neil Gilman, who wrote a book called The Death of Death, a very important book, where he says, isn't it a shame that modernity and rationalism has rejected some of the most hopeful and beautiful concepts that existed in Judaism about what happens when people die? Maybe we should reclaim those. Okay, look at number 8. In full accordance with the spirit of Mosaic legislation, which governs the relationships of rich and poor, our duty to participate in modern times, this becomes social action, which for many of you remember in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was the entirety of the projection of what's Reform Judaism about. We are social action advocates. The question was, did we lose religious grounding and just became social activists? Rhetorical question. So this platform, 1885, influenced the evolving Reform community in the United States over the next period of time until 1837, when Jessica next week is going to be talking about the Columbus platform, which was the next representation of what it was that this particular group of rabbis who went to that thought were the paradigms and the existence of Judaism. Some questions for you to carry with you over the next week. We've looked today at some of the evolution of the 19th century. And what I'd like you to be thinking about is, what were their beliefs? How did they come to them? Why were they necessary in their mind? And was their thinking what you would want? I'm not saying we should criticize what they did in 1885, but you have to be able to build a bridge to where we are in 2023 in terms of how do we understand? One of the most profound impacts of the Pittsburgh platform is something which I've done with many of you over the course of time, and that is just react to a Hebrew word. What does the word mitzvah mean? Almost universally, people will say a good deed. What's happened in the Pittsburgh platform is by separating out ritual activity from ethical behavior, they changed the idea of mitzvah being a commandment, a descriptive norm in our lives, to a good deed. Because it's a mitzvah is as much as lighting Shabbat candles, which isn't necessarily a good deed, as it is to not cursing the deaf or putting a stumbling block before the blind. I want you to think about how the impact of this platform has insinuated itself into Jewish thinking over the past 140 years, and how we are still in many ways living with the consequences of this ideology, and that maybe that's where we want to be, but maybe it isn't. Okay, thoughts?
You can unmute if you have any thoughts. Just the way you're framing it is so, I've read these a million times, but just the way you're contextualizing and the questions you're asking before you show us the parts is so eye-opening, and it's also so self-fulfilling. You can't help but think about where we are today in light of this. I always think about, I just jotted a note, my brother died of a 9/11 related cancer, but it was 16 years later, and I never know if those, people the terrorists who flew the planes into the tower, did they know people wouldn't just die on the day, but 18 years later and more? It's the same thing here in the when they set this up, did they have a long-term goal? Dan just taught us this concept. Let me see if I can find it, of a 50-year projection, not a 20-year, but a 50-year projection. When we plan something, we think about 1 year or 5 years or 10 years. But do we ever think about what things will look like in 50 years? And this is were they really in a way, it's Mosaic, it's the brilliance of Moses, to just be able to think. It's called can I share? It's Dan just taught us this concept he learned. It's here, let me go slideshow. It's a concept of from current slide, where you kind of think about things, you see it goes out from the middle. So this is your short term, and then longer term, and then longer term. Where do you think they were in was this a a 1-year plan, a 5-year 10. I remember when I used to guide Masada, we'd show people they built like rudimentary mikvahs on top of Herod's beautiful mosaics because they came there to live. Mikvah is part of living because you have to go in relation to, procreation and things like that. So what do you think they thought?
Well, it's a fascinating question, and I don't know if we can really get into their heads, but we certainly can see the impact of their thinking, the way that it has influenced subsequent generations of Jews. And also, some of I have a background of working in American foreign affairs on the staff of 5 members of Congress. And one of my professors, who was so important to me in understanding how ideas function, said to me, when you are dealing with heads of state or legislators or people of influence, you must go back to when they were between 18 and 23 and understand what the dominant cultural forces and ideas were of that time, because that's where their concepts were framed, and see how they've evolved and whether in fact they've changed any of their ideas. Well, the same thing is true about our multi-generational Jewish world. And that is, who are the idea makers of today? Who are the people who are setting the standards, the norms, the practices for us? And where did they get them from? And are there anyone who you can identify the way we could in generations past, like a Gene Borowitz, who was the instrumental thinker of the Reform movement? I will tell you, and again, this is something that disturbs me, I can't identify that name in the modern Jewish world today. And that's something that's a challenge for me. But thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi Kotok. This is just fascinating. We'll see you next week at noon. Everyone have a wonderful week. Thank you